All right, I think we'll start this afternoon. So I want to thank you all for joining us today for this important presentation, COVID, Death by Despair. Today's program is being presented by Providence Life Services. We are a senior living organization with communities in Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. My name is Robin Pisak, and I am the Vice President of Marketing for Providence Life Services. And I'm so glad that you could all join us today. Before I turn it over to our speaker, Colleen, I'd like to cover just a couple of housekeeping topics. We invite your comments and your questions. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen that you see two buttons. One is for chat and one is for Q&A. If you think of a question for the speaker at any time, you can use either button, type in your question, and we're going to answer all of the questions at the end of today's presentation. Also, one continuing education unit is being provided to social workers, nurses, counselors, and therapists who attend the entirety of this live session today. This continuing education unit is available to those that are attending in Illinois and Indiana today. You will receive an email confirmation and an evaluation link after the session's completed. Sometimes those evaluations take a few days to come through, so don't be alarmed if you don't get it today, but you will get that evaluation. And then once you complete your evaluation and send that back in, or it's an online survey. So once you submit your evaluation, you will, in a couple of weeks, you will receive your certificate. So today's presenter is Colleen Beckvar. Colleen is a gerontologist. She is the owner and operator of the Oak Brook, Illinois-based advocacy firm, Trinity Advocacy Group. Ms. Say Beckvar holds a Master of Science in Gerontology and enjoys a 26-year career of assisting vulnerable seniors, the disabled, and their families through tenacious advocacy efforts, education, and guidance. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Colleen, who will start today's presentation. Welcome, Colleen.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to spend with me this afternoon and with our gracious host, Providence Life Services. I'm going to share my screen here so that we can get started on our presentation. We did a little run through here. So let's see. Go back to that. Sorry about that. Of course it works in the run through. There we go. Okay, ta-da. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Colleen Say Beckvar. Thank you, Robin, for the invitation, the gracious introduction. I love what I do, and I know that my colleagues here at Trinity Advocacy Group do too. We are Oak Brook based. We serve multiple counties in Illinois specifically, although we have had some cases just over the border in Northwest Indiana as well. So our services are really directed at being the voice for vulnerable adults. And so that's typically older adults, but can also span into the disability world. And we are the information I'm going to be sharing with you this afternoon are based on real cases that we had here at Trinity Advocacy Group through COVID. And I know a lot of us are getting a little inundated with COVID statistics and numbers and vaccines, and right, it continues to be at the tip of our tongue. I think part of what we'll be talking about today in terms of ethics hopefully gives you a framework to be able to use right in your communities or within your own families, and hopefully teaches you just a little bit about, maybe offers a different perspective to you. This presentation is based on an article that I had written for the DuPage County Bar Association. And the idea was this, we have to balance this social isolation protocols with which is absolutely essential and life-saving, with the reality that social isolation is also lethal for some people. And so that was the impetus for the writing of the article. And from that article, I developed a presentation around this topic on ethics. And so the frameworks that I'm going to be sharing with you today will hopefully be very friendly, user-friendly to any of you who you can take. And that's always the purpose of my presentations, is to give you practical information that is useful and applicable right out of the gate, so to speak. So we have quite a bit of content to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. And then the whole idea behind this presentation is to look at the dilemma. And you only have a dilemma when there's more than one perspective, right? And we didn't have a big dilemma when it came to the dawn of COVID-19 in the United States and across the world. The entire world was in agreement that we had to be protective of our lives, of ourselves, of our families, of our jobs, of our commerce. We all went into hunkering down mode and out of protection. The problem came in when these very protocols designed to help all of us survive started to create these unintended consequences. And we're going to talk a fair amount about what that looks like and why I titled the presentation Death by Despair. Because what I was finding was, yes, people were certainly dying from COVID. That was my experience with a number of my clients, I'm sad to say. But also what I was finding is people were dying from despair, this unending concern about when they would see their loved ones again, when they would get fresh air again, and a variety of other things that we'll cover. So let's look about the, some of those life-saving measures that nobody knew, or few people knew at the beginning of 2020 what PPE was. Now we all know what that is. And hand washing, many of us in the healthcare arena, of course, we know that hand washing is a huge protocol. How many of us were practicing perhaps the way that we should have been? And then we were all really squarely reminded of how we needed to do that, that in fact, it was in some cases the difference between contracting COVID or spreading COVID. And of course, disease prevention was maintaining this social distancing of 6 feet. And so, but what were we saving people from, right? Obviously, we were saving them from COVID-19. That was the whole idea. We were all in agreement that was absolutely essential. And as time went on, it became politicized, and people started to get fragmented, and that's okay, because the trauma was becoming normalized. And so that's a very normal response. But we were protecting people from COVID, but what was rising in the background and very real for people was despair. So, as you know, the statistics are that people over the age of 60 were and remain in the highest risk age group for dying from COVID. Not necessarily contracting it, but is more lethal for the older adult body. But I don't know if you also knew that social isolation these are before COVID. These statistics were before COVID, that 43% of people before COVID were saying, or seniors rather, and in my world, that's 60 plus. So feel lonely on a regular basis. And 45% were dying sooner than the average population because they were reporting loneliness. And that loneliness is akin, they say now, is more dangerous than obesity and more damaging than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so for those non-smokers, that's almost a pack a day. And these are pre-COVID statistics. So we know that loneliness and that social isolation was already lethal to the senior population. Now, this may not have been mainstream knowledge, but this was the reality. And these all of these were government statistics gathered by our own Department on Aging. Let's look for a second what this meant for people living in community, older adults living not so much in a single family home, but living in many of the communities that so many of us as advocates and as daughters and sons and nieces and nephews look to when our loved ones are starting to become more vulnerable. Well, we want that housing option that helps anticipate and meet all of their needs. So these folks are living now in community. Pick one of any of the ones that Robin just introduced to you, right? So rightly, these organizations, these communities were saying no visitors. Meals needed to be taken in your room. No more congregate meals. No group activities. Solo activities only. Reasonable, right? Life-saving from COVID. You are living in this environment. I want you to picture that, because I think sometimes we get a little desensitized, particularly because we're in this serving mode. So we're always serving perhaps that older adult. But imagine yourself as this older adult, as this vulnerable person. So now you can't see your friends, your neighbors. You don't see your favorite waitress or cook or CNA or the maintenance guy, right, that you would pass every day on the way to lunch, whatever that is. You're getting your information about COVID from 3 primary resources. The news on your television, which is on all the time right now because that's the way you're passing the time. You're also getting your information from a masked, gowned, and gloved employee, right, that you may or may not recognize, because it's very possible that you are sensory deficient, right? Your eyesight might be diminished as an older adult. Your hearing may be diminished. And people with hearing loss, you may already know this, of course, when you start losing your hearing, you start naturally reading lips. So now you've got somebody who's masked. And sometimes you are being given the occasional written update from your community's leadership. And what they're detailing is the number of COVID positive results in your building, not just from the residents, but from the people who are serving you, the staff. If you are that older adult, do you feel safer by these updates that you're receiving, or do you feel even more isolated? You know, the idea here is not to make you wrong. If you say, oh God, I feel safer, these are people that I trust giving me the information. Or you might say, I feel more isolated because I don't get to see anybody and everything I'm getting is negative and scary and scary and scarier and scarier and scarier, and I can't see my kids. And all of these things are unfolding in front of me on the news that I can't turn off because I need to know what's happening in the outside world, because I don't have anybody bringing me the outside world to me right now. There's no wrong answer. I just want you to consider what that experience is. Your options are not dynamic. You have one or two. Do you feel safer or do you feel more isolated? Let's talk a little bit about Joe. Joe is, the names have been changed on these cases, but Joe was 83. Before COVID, he was 83. He was a widower of 15 years. Joe was my favorite type of client, I should say, feisty, opinionated, and determined. And I love feisty, opinionated, and determined older adults because they keep me on my toes. And I appreciate that. Joe is a family man. He raised 3 nieces as his own children. He had severe congestive heart failure. It was receiving dialysis 3 times a week. He was a full code. And what that means is Joe made it very clear to me, and we were his guardians. So he made it very, very clear to me that no matter what happened to him, he wanted every medical intervention to keep him alive. And the reason why that was for Joe was one of his 3 nieces with special needs. And Joe felt an enormous, not only cultural responsibility, he was of Asian descent, but also a paternal responsibility to this nephew. I'm sorry, to this niece, who, without Joe's support, he feared would not be well taken care of by the other two nieces. Um, Joe got COVID-19, and I was convinced this was the end of the line for Joe because of all of these comorbidities. So, but he absolutely survived COVID-19. And honestly, I feel like I've thought about this a lot, and I never did ask for the clinical confirmation of this, but I honestly feel like Joe probably survived that because of the dialysis, because dialysis was removing a lot of that, the fluids from his body that would build up and make his CHF so much worse. But he survived. He was living in a nursing home at the time because he needed dialysis 3 times a week, and this facility was offering that for him. And then he went into the hospital. He came back from the hospital. And we were tenacious advocates for our clients, asking repeatedly, particularly if we were their guardians or powers of attorney, that we would have access to that person visually through virtual visits. And most of the communities that we work with were very supportive of that. And so I'll never forget when I saw Joe, after he got back from and survived COVID, and I saw his face, and he was so weary-eyed and so lonely. The staff member who dutifully got that FaceTime call ready for Joe and I to have was standing there, sort of monitoring and assisting Joe. And I don't mean monitoring in any negative way, just that she was there doing her job, holding that for Joe. Joe was very cautious with me, and he was worried and fearful about his surroundings. What he was saying to me is he was so tired of all the yelling. I had never heard him say that. And I said, "What do you mean, Joe?" And he said, "Well, it's the staff. They're yelling all the time, and they're yelling at me, and they're yelling at each other, and there's so much tension here." And then as soon as he said it and it was out, he started to recant. I could see him realize that he had just sort of told on the very person who was serving him. And that was so scary for him, because he had just sort of outed the very people that are responsible for his care. And he was feeling helpless to support his family. He was unable to manage some of the communication tools that were and his one niece that would come to him every week, sometimes multiple times a week, and bring him whatever he wanted. Culturally, they enjoyed certain kinds of foods. Well, that was no longer an option for him. He felt lost without his family visits. And many weeks later, we got a call, a shocking call, that Joe had been doing well and had been recovering and recovering and recovering. And then we got a call one night that he had died quite suddenly and alone. And that was devastating for him and his family. And I will say to us, what I feel like I saw in Joe's eyes and other clients' eyes was despair. And I wanted to find despair for you, and why I selected the word despair, because it looks a lot like depression. And it's a withdrawal, and it's withdrawal from pleasurable activities. It's significant weight loss, pervasive feelings of helplessness. And what is different from depression than despair is the complete loss or absence of hope, that there is no light at the end of the tunnel, that everything that matters to you is ostensibly gone and removed. And that's certainly where Joe was. The remedy to those social isolation statistics I shared with you a few slides ago, according to our own US government, they rolled out these programs called togetherness programs. Togetherness programs are bringing people together, right? That was the remedy for social isolation. But as we also talked about, those remedies were not available, are still not available, and we're getting closer. We're not there yet. And so loneliness and isolation has led to suicidal ideation, parasuicide, dementia symptoms, and adverse effects of immune and cardiovascular systems. So suicidal ideation, you know what that is. I did not know what parasuicide meant. And so many of you may, but I'll define for you what it is because I didn't know. Parasuicide is, you can look at maybe a synonym for that is self-harm, or that people are taking so much medication deliberately to harm themselves, but not enough to be lethal. It's no less a symptom as suicide or a predictor of a real mental health struggle. But I just wanted to define that for you. Dementia symptoms, right? That makes sense. There's no stimulation. If you're only watching TV all day, which we know is horrible for your mind, and it's everything is very passive, or you're already diminished in either physically or cognitively, that isolation is the worst thing for your mental health and well-being. Let's talk about Alice for a moment. This is my second and only other case study. Then we're going to jump into these ethical principles. Alice, before COVID, is 73. She was a social butterfly. She was living in a community right outside Chicago. And she led the card games and the Wii bowling tournaments for the whole campus. And this is a huge campus. She spent hours daily in the common areas of her building, just watching the comings and goings, the hellos to the mailman, the hellos to the family members who were coming to see other people. And she was sort of the belle of the ball. She lived 10 years in the independent living of this particular community, and was also needed the supportive living part of this community. Alice had a chronic lung condition, and so she was oxygen dependent before COVID. So she knew the risks to her own health. In fact, she knew if she wasn't careful, she would absolutely be at enormously high risk to die from COVID if contracted. So she took it all very seriously. After many months of isolation, Alice started having, of course, the shutdown began. She had meals delivered to her room. All of her family and friends visits and all of those social contacts she was having downstairs, watching the comings and goings and the card games and the Wii bowling, it all stopped. Alice was naturally hard of hearing, and phone calls were frustrating, but they were her only link for a while. And she just stopped trying to even manage those at all. Her weight loss was significant, and that ensued muscle wasting. She wasn't using her mind as much, her body as much. She is in a very small unit. She started to really increase her complaints about pain, which was new for her. She had this overall decline in health and well-being, and she had a very significant loss in function. Just, the oxygen dependency increased, the ability to get around even her small unit was very difficult for her. And she started really just to kind of give up, not just on the phone calls, but also on her self-care. She just didn't care anymore. In late August, and you'll remember the shutdown began in March, she started to refuse her weekend meals, and that got the attention of one of the staff members because that wasn't like Alice. So they rightly sent her to the ER after she was not really responding in her typical self. She too was a little feisty. Alice would be diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that had metastasized. It had spread to 7 regions of her upper body, and she died 5 days later. I can't say that social isolation created the environment for Alice to succumb during that period of time to cancer. But what I can say is this: her treating physician of several years, never detected the cancerous tissue. In March of 2020, She had fallen at the community and she rightly went out to the hospital where she fractured ribs. And so that required a diagnostic x-ray. And during that diagnostic x-ray on the same side where the massive tumor in her breast was found just however many months later, 6 months later, it never detected any abnormalities beyond the ribs themselves. Would Alice have succumbed to COVID or to cancer, COVID or non-COVID? I don't know. What I do know is that social isolation creates a physical susceptibility and a weakened immune system. That's not my opinion, that's research. For Alice, it weakened her immune response and perhaps created an environment that was insufficient to slow the growth of cancer that impacted 7 body systems. And that, by the way, folks, was just from the waist up, because we never took it to that next step where we looked at the rest of her body, because there was some discussion about that with the oncologist. Well, we should maybe make sure that this is a cancer diagnosis and we can treat it and all of those things until we got some of the rest of the results. And then it was very clear that Alice would not be going back to her community. Loneliness is deadly. 50% of people die prematurely. Did Alice and did Joe and did many of the other people living in your communities also die as a result, not of COVID, but of social isolation? Are you seeing people who are depleted in terms of their energy levels and what they're able to do and their functioning? It reduces your immunity. It increases inflammation. This is what loneliness does. It's a chemical response. It increases heart disease, cancer, and neuroskeletal diseases such as osteoporosis and diabetic neuropathy. And so this is where we turn our attention to the dilemma that we have. And the ethical dilemma comes up because there are two or more opposing ideas about what is appropriate. And the fun thing about ethics is, and the frustrating thing about ethics is there is no right answer to an ethical question. There are optimal answers, but you have to remember when you talk about ethics that we have many different stakeholders, people with all different kinds of opinions. And really the CDC guidelines is what we were all looking at for good reason. Let's look at some of these ethical issues that came up and talk a little bit about a best practice tool that I hope that you will find very useful. Generally speaking, when we're talking about ethics, there are bioethical, so biological ethical principles, bioethical principles that many of you may be familiar with. And any of you that are coming to us today from for any number of disciplines, nursing, social services, attorneys, therapists, nursing home administrators, and a variety of others, each one of your professional disciplines has its own ethical guidelines or code of ethics. But within all of those, you may call it something different in your own profession, but these are well accepted phrases, and we're going to define them: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. Autonomy is really something we talk about so very often in the older adult communities. Although I will say, I've been doing this work of advocacy for 26 years, and I will say that I'm hearing less and less about autonomy. And I don't know if that's just because it's so mainstream or we've forgotten about it. I'm not sure. More along the lines is what you will hear these days is self-determination. We have this inherent respect for our autonomy, particularly in Western culture. Part of those principles are telling the truth, respecting the privacy of others, protecting confidential information, right? That's what our HIPAA releases are born out of, in part. Obtain consent for interventions with patients. Beneficence is the principle of beneficence is a moral obligation to act for the benefit of others. And there are two principles within this theory of beneficence, and that is providing benefits and balancing the benefits of risk and harm. And I'm going to get to how this applies in particular to this conversation around COVID versus social isolation in just a moment. So the principle of beneficence supports the moral obligation you and I have to protect and defend the rights of others, that we prevent harm from occurring to others, and we remove conditions that will cause harm. We help people with disabilities, and we rescue persons in danger. And I think we see beneficence a lot in our civil servants. Also, a lot of what maybe many of us do on this call, we're drawn to this profession of helping. Another is non-malfeasance, and non-malfeasance is called a variety of things in other professions. But one thing that you might be most familiar with is the Hippocratic Oath, which is one that physicians take, and the whole idea behind that is first, do no harm. This principle of non-malfeasance is that there's an obligation not to inflict harm on other people, and along these same lines is do not kill, do not cause pain or suffering, do not incapacitate, and do not cause offense. And then there's finally this idea of justice. The principle of justice obliges all of us as individuals to an equal share of what's available out there, right? Think your vaccines, right? Do we all have access? And it's really interesting how these vaccines have rolled out. We have tiers, TIERS, tiers of who gets that for those vaccines first. They are prioritized. That's the principle of justice, according to need, according to effort, according to contribution, and according to merit. I want to introduce to you a model. It may not be new to you, but it was new to me, and I really like it. And as an overlay to how we might be considering these conversations with our older adult population and vulnerable adults of all ages, really, to help them make these decisions about their own lives. And do they want to live with COVID or die from social isolation? And I think we owe them the right to have that conversation. So let's talk about what this approach. It's called the SHARE approach. And so you can see that SHARE stands for seek, help, assess, reach, and evaluate. So seek your patient's participation. I think we have an obligation to the people that we serve to ask, to let them know they have a choice. That choice was taken away from so many of our older adults, and many of you who are serving them in the communities your hands are tied behind your back because you are also getting your direction from the departments of public health. And sometimes those are unrelenting and unfavorable to the social piece of and the important piece of a person's life. But that choice still exists for your client, for your resident. So communicating that a choice does exist and invite your patient or your resident to be involved in those decisions. What is the choice here? The choice is to say, okay, I understand that I could die from COVID if I go out there. I understand that I could kill my neighbors by bringing COVID back in. I understand that if I want to see my loved one, that I have to move out, or that I have to take all of these precautions, that I'm going to go to Thanksgiving dinner or whatever that is, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to social isolate. But what has happened in so many conversations is that they're one-sided, and our older adults are just being told that they don't have a choice, and that no, you will stay in your room and you will get your meal delivered, and you will. Nobody's offering the choice. And I have an issue with that, because I think that people have, not everybody has, I understand this, the capacity to fully understand the choices in front of them. That's a different conversation, and we can attack that. I understand that. We can have that dialogue. But our older adults Many of them are living with physical disabilities, not cognitive disabilities, and they do get a choice. And my husband happens to be a teacher, and I know the amount of choices that they gave to their students: stay at home, come into school, hybrid, combination, all of these choices. I mean, the Chicago public school system, right? They were on strike trying to come to a resolution about choice. Why don't we grant that to our older adult population? I suggest we should. Help your patient explore and compare treatment options. I love this. Discuss the benefits and the risk of every option. Are we even giving people the choice to decline this idea of a vaccine? And I frankly, I don't know what that choice is that's being given to communities. You may not even, it may just be understood that everybody in that community is going to be vaccinated. I don't know, but I would propose that these patients need to be given to explore those options. They need to be given, if I want to risk my exposure to COVID and die a terribly painful death where I can't breathe anymore, with the possibility of recovery? Or do I want to not say hello to my new grandchild, to get a card, to get a hug, to get company, to get a second set of eyes on me, to have somebody help me pay my bills, to help somebody, all of those things that they enjoyed pre-shutdown? Step 3, assess your patient's values and preferences. We have to take them into account. And I don't know that we're doing that. And I think we should. Step 4, reach a decision with your patient. Sometimes we forget about this principle of autonomy and we start making unilateral decisions. And again, I don't fault the people in leadership at these at the communities. I don't, because I don't think you guys, some of those folks are being given much wiggle room. But where does that conversation start? Who's representing that individual's interest? Evaluate your patient's decision. Plan to revisit that decision and monitor its implementation. Let's say, for example, so I had a client whose daughter, whose mom had COVID and was living in the COVID wing of a location, and whose dad lived because she had COVID, and whose dad was living in the independent living portion of this community. And she called me and she said, Colleen, how do I do this? Like, my dad can't see my mom. And there were, when it comes to extenuating circumstances, there are sometimes there's some leeway. But in this particular case, the decision was that, could mom die alone? Would she have to? And so bringing the mom up to the dad's apartment and allowing them all to hold and have a sacred space in her final weeks of life was extremely important. And so this family knew the risks to themselves and to their dad, and they gave him that choice. And so they made a decision as a family with the permission and cooperation of the community, and they made it happen for her. So here's just a summary of all of those things in this share model. So what are some solutions? So from the practical, so many of our clients are suffering from the impact of social isolation. And I'm not talking just the functional disability, though that's certainly a part of it. Are we starting to leverage then when things start loosening up even further? Are you going to be advocating for your residents to start getting occupational and physical therapy in droves up and down your hallways, getting people back to their physical functioning? Because I know sometimes you can't do that right now because rightly your communities are not allowing people to come in. Also, telehealth and Zoom. Are we getting people psychological support? Are we getting them the psychological support that they need? They are grieving. They are grieving actively. They're grieving the loss of their functioning. They're grieving the loss of their families. They're grieving the possible loss of their future. Again, this comes back to despair. There is no hope, but there's help. And so I encourage you to tap into those psychological support resources that come right in home or telephonic, which is very common, as you all know right now. Practitioner's order for life-sustaining treatment. This document has replaced in some cases the do not resuscitate form in Illinois. If we feel like a person is going to pass away within a year from any diagnosis, really the POST should be completed. And as an advocate, I love this document because it offers so many more options than just the yes or no. Yes, I want to be resuscitated, or no, I don't. POST allows that person to give more instruction. Do they want comfort measures? Do they want to try life-sustaining treatment for a certain but defined period of time? It just really gives more voice to that person. 5 wishes. That is an older document. Some of you have been around a long time, know this document well. It's a wonderful document. It's a robust document. And 5 wishes talks about everything from who is your power of attorney, what readings do you want at your religious services, if you want them at all upon your passing. You know, you can write a letter to your family to be given to them after they pass away. It's really, it's a well done document and recognized in Illinois still as a robust planning document. One of the key solutions I feel that we have to consider when you start talking with people about this choice between living in sustained social isolation or succumbing to COVID, these are the conversations that our palliative and hospice professionals are seasoned at having with our clients every day of the week. We don't have to reinvent this conversation. This conversation is a candid dialogue that our palliative and hospice professionals are absolutely trained to have. So don't feel like you have to sit in conversation alone with the resident that you're serving or with your loved one and say, look, Dad, these are your options. Get that palliative and hospice consult. Have that person come up with a plan. We've forgotten that we have a choice in the matter. Let's address some of these systemic issues. I was explaining earlier about all of the options that our students and our younger population had. Even all of us as employees, those of us who are on this call who are working individuals, we had choices many times given to us about how we wanted to manage our own employment and what was that going to look like. But we didn't give that choice to the warehoused older adults. And when I say warehouse, this is not a criticism of the senior housing community. I have a great deal of respect for that. Thank God they exist. But there are those entities out there, and a lot of our social programs, not social programs, a lot of our funding to some of these communities that accept Medicare and Medicaid and things like that, they're strong-armed into just accepting these huge decisions, and it's ageist. We've forgotten that people who are living in these communities this is their home. We've forgotten to address their individuality, to ask them that question. We also have to acknowledge the fact that of the socioeconomic disparities of our paid and hired caregivers. Part of the spread that happened in nursing homes across the country is believed in part to do with the fact that our caregivers who are working certain shifts at one nursing home go to another nursing home whose protocols for COVID may be less than impressive. They're not following CDC guidelines. And that caregiver, him or herself, also might be responsible for caring for a loved one at home. And so that one caregiver in and of him or herself is spreading that disease because she can't afford to only work at one company at a time. And the companies themselves don't want to pay her enough that, or give her enough hours that she gets benefits. So she's forced, or he's forced into looking for these low paying jobs just to make ends meet. That's a socioeconomic disparity. We also need public health to get involved on social isolation outcomes. Because I'll tell you, the DuPage County Health Department called me within days of Joe coming back from the hospital after he recovered or was in the recovery period of COVID. They had all kinds of questions for me about what his symptoms were and where did he go and how long did it take and all of these questions. But when Joe would die later, I didn't get one phone call. Nobody was tracking Joe's social isolation. And yet we know that's as deadly. We must give voice to the voiceless. You may or may not know, but Adult Protective Services, the people who are employed to be able to protect our most vulnerable, were not considered essential workers. We also have to be careful of what I'm calling COVID complacency. There is absolutely something to how COVID has slowed down the process for so many of us in doing business as usual. But now I want you to be very careful, and I want you to really start listening, and I want you to hear yourselves too. We started to come to this knee-jerk response, COVID complacency, COVID as an excuse for why things are less than productive. There was a time when that was true, but I think that time has passed, and we have to stop. We have to start challenging people. Well, it's because of COVID. Well, right. But now we've been dealing with that for over a year. So I'm pretty sure you have protocols in place. And so I encourage you to push beyond the COVID excuse, because what was once absolutely a factor has now fallen in some realms, created complacency. Family visits are so much more than friendly visits. Yes, there's that. But I know, and you know, that when families are around, there's an extra set of eyes, an extra set of hands, an extra set of help to that resident, to that loved one. And sure, it can be stressful, but I will never forget the day that I heard someone from a memory care unit say to me quite candidly that it was easier for them to care for their own residents because they didn't have the family to put up with. And I was shocked and saddened. And I think all of my fears came to the surface. Like, I worried that that was happening, but then she put the words to it. And it was exactly the biggest thing that I feared, that nobody was looking and nobody could get in to look. And that terrifies me. We get creative, right? The Florida wife who took a dishwashing job, because she couldn't bear to be away from her husband. I know of a family here in Chicago. The family sneaks their 90-something loved one out the back door of the community so they can resume their weekly in-person visits with their 91-year-old loved one. They had been doing this for many, many years. They masked, they did all of the social distancing, but they went around the protocols of the community to do that. And I'm not saying that I agree with that. I'm just saying people are finding creative ways to figure this out. Just like anything else, if the need is great enough, people will go underground and take huge risks, not just for themselves, but to the communities around them. I have to apologize. I don't know what's going on outside right now, but it sounds pretty awful. So I'm sorry if you are hearing that. Residents have adopted, and so have staff at local communities here. Don't ask, don't tell. As soon as the staff leaves, the residents are going out into the hallway. They're having their card games. They go into other people's units and they continue their own social affairs. And we know this is happening. The wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Sometimes the staff members are turning the other way. Other times they're fully aware, but residents are trying to find some of their own solution. But one of the things that makes life living possible is to be with the people that we love and to do the things that we absolutely love doing. And so if life is not about, and this is not me, I found this quote, but life is not about living the safer option, though I understand and I respect the COVID protocols, but the unintended consequences we're finding are just as deadly and perhaps a slow, painful, agonizing withering away than the quick, painful reality of COVID. Life is about living a life worth living. And so insofar as we can help with that, there are two other things actually that I wanted to mention to you in terms of resources. One of those resources, just so you know, is for those of you who are interested in in learning about some of our, I'm trying to remember the name of the group. It's called Illinois. It's a compassionate caregivers for choices. And it's a Facebook group. And it's all of these family members and professionals who have seen social isolation create a deadly response in their loved ones or their residents or their clients. And so these folks have banded together, and it actually started out of state, and it's a national movement, but it's really very prolific here in Illinois. These folks are trying to impact social policy, allowing access to nursing homes. And part of the legislation that came from Governor Pritzker right before the holidays, you may or may not know this, allows one family member to be designated as an essential worker. And these essential worker family members are being allowed under Governor Pritzker's executive order, entrance into these communities. And so if you're a community and you don't know about this legislation, it's really very important that you arm yourself with it. And if you don't have the protocols to allow the essential caregiver who's a family member, and it's not like you can have Fred on Wednesday and June on Thursday and Sarah on Friday. It's one family caregiver designated to be that, or a family member designated to be that essential worker. And that person has to comply. For those of you on the call today with the communities, they have to comply with those PPE protocols and other protocols that you have in place. They're not asking you to abandon those, but that you have to allow somebody in now to see those family members. So I know we have made that really very available to our clients' family members, and it's been very helpful. Those are that's what I have for all of you today, but I would like to answer any questions that you may have as well.
Okay. Colleen, I think what we'll do is I just have a couple things to go over here for the participants, and then we will, I'm not sure we have a lot of questions, but we'll open it up there. Colleen, that was excellent information. And I believe we are recording this and we'll send out to all of the participants that attended the presentation today so that you can have it. I particularly found the share information that you provided could be extremely helpful for those of us working in communities. So thank you for that. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, Providence Life Services is proud to own and operate 12 senior living communities in Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge those of our communities that are represented here today. And so we have Emerald Meadows, who is it's an providing assisted living and memory care. And Annalise is our contact person there, that's located in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Then we have Park Place of Elmhurst is also a sponsor of this presentation today as well. We offer independent living, assisted living, skilled nursing, memory care, and rehab at that community, and Laura Walsh is our contact person there. Park Place of St. John is a sponsor, and they are independent living, skilled nursing, memory care, and rehab, and Lisa is our contact person at Park Place of St. John in our skilled. Then we have Royal A. Treeman, who is our assisted living. They are in our assisted living community located in Zeeland, Michigan. Kim is our representative from Royal Atrium Inn that's joining us today. And then we have Saratoga Grove and Providence Rehab, located in Downers Grove, Illinois. We offer at that community independent living, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing, and rehab. Our Providence of Downers Grove community has also, for a long period of time during the pandemic, has had a designated COVID unit, and we're so blessed to have had that unit to be able to serve not only our residents throughout Providence Life Services, but they have served seniors throughout Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. So we're blessed that they have been there and providing that service. Renee is joining us from Saratoga Grove today. Next is our Victorian Village community, which is located in Homer Glen, Illinois. They offer independent living, assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing, and rehab. And we have Kathy and Tracy joining us from Victorian Village today. And finally, actually, I think we have one more after this. Village Woods is our community located in Crete, Illinois. We have Diana with us, and in that community, we offer independent and assisted living. And finally, our final sponsor for today's presentation with Colleen is Providence at Home. Providence at Home is a home health and private duty portion of Providence Life Services, and we serve clients in Illinois and Indiana. Okay, so with that, I think what I'm going to do is, it looks like we have a couple of questions. So thank you for that nice compliment, Alex. Thank you, Colleen, for this very informative presentation. And then we have a question here. The question is, can you talk a little bit more about the family member as an essential worker? How can they go back and forth into the community? Do they need frequent testing? I have an uncle in a senior living community and being alone, and I can coach his children. I may be able to answer a part of that, and Colleen, please feel free to add as well. I believe the program is technically called, you can look on the Illinois Department of Public Health website, but the program, I believe, is technically called the Essential Family Caregiver Program. And the family member that is participating in the program has to follow the same guidelines of testing, wearing PPE, limited access to common areas that the staff has to participate in as well. And I speak to that from our experiences at Providence as we've implemented that in our communities. But Colleen, would you have anything else to share in regards to that?
Only to say what I am happy to do is share that as part of the materials that you'll be getting as attendees today. So I'll send that legislation out, but I could only echo what you said, Robin, and that is my experience as well. Is yes, that you have to succumb to, so to speak, or cooperate with being able to keep the other residents who are living in the community safe. And so there are strict protocols in place, but it does get you in, if you're willing to abide by those, to see your loved one.
Okay, well, I think that'll wrap this program up for today. Colleen, I would like to thank you again for that wonderful, informative presentation, and just the experiences that you shared, your personal experiences with your clients. It's really, and I'm sure many of the folks that are on this webinar today have seen similar situations. It really is, but the valuable information that you shared as a way to help, I think is really beneficial for all of us. And as a reminder, if you have a question, actually, let me finish up here, just wrap up. As a reminder, if you're seeking the continuing education credit for today's session, an email is going to be sent to you to the email address that you provided when you registered. When you complete that evaluation, it will get submitted and you will receive your CE certificate. Colleen, I think they do take, it generally could take a few weeks, correct? So people shouldn't be alarmed if they don't see it within the next few days.
we typically say 1 month from the date of, so we'll send out, a survey will be sent to you, and then we usually give 1 week for you to complete the survey. And 1 week from that, I'm sorry, 1 month from that date is when you should have your your certificates within that time. And then Robin, I want to know from you, if we are sending that, but I believe you are sending that to our attendees. Correct.
The survey?
The certificates.
Oh, the certificates. I think they're actually coming from, I'm not exactly sure. We'll work it out between the two of us. Colleen, I'm not exactly sure whether it'll be coming from CEII or from URI. So we'll work that out.
Wonderful.
I do also want to take a moment to remind everybody that we do have another program coming up in March, and the date of that is March 16th, and the presentation is called Elder Mediation. So you should have received that invitation for that program when you received this invitation, and the registration is open for that, so please feel free to register for that if you plan to attend or would like to attend that program as well. So again, I would like to thank everybody for attending. And if anyone here has any additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to the Providence Life Services community in your area, or reach out to us at info@provlife.com, and we will connect you with the right person. So thank you all very much. I appreciate your time. And Colleen, thank you so much again.
My pleasure.
Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.
You too.
Thanks.